Hi everyone. Thank you so much for the hard work that you did last night. I'm going to take you to, I want you to first of all notice, I'm taking the video off, and I want you to notice the weeks 8 and 9. So this is for this week and next week. Um, we're combining those weeks and support videos. So here's the agenda for last night and the expectations. And then for week 9, remember we're splitting up the class. So with Dr. Jez, we'll be writing the results section and the summary, and Professor Talbot will be doing the Woodcock-Johnson administration for those of you who were not able to administer in your sites. So let's go back. Oh, we didn't need to start on that slide. We'll go back to just kind of review what happened last night. Just a nice reminder, we have the internship email that Sergio sent out to everybody. Make sure if you're interested in an internship that you complete that. We did the warm-up where we talked about the mindful minutes. I really do recommend that even if it starts with 2 minutes, that you try to find some time to get quiet and allow your brain a little break. And then we talked about what do all teachers need to know about the high stakes testing. This was a little controversial because I know we talk fairly negatively about high stakes testing and assessment. And then this module kind of says, you know, this is necessary, but I think we need to also keep in mind the dichotomies that go on in education, that there's not a quick, easy answer for everything, but that our job as educators is to make sure that we're meeting the needs of all of our students in the best way possible. Then we talked about the interpreting the scores. So in the examiner's manual, remember they go through and they actually explicitly tell you which tests are more complex and less complex, and they go through and they talk about what the tasks are for each test. So you know if they did very poorly in the oral reading, that's oral reading of sentences, and you know, those are printed sentences versus test 1, which is printed letters. So you can kind of see how your student is you know, on the spectrum of a more complex task versus less. Same thing with math, and then this one is the writing one. So use the examiner's manual to really interpret some of your test results. And then this is just to kind of remind us that we've taken a lot of different information about our student now, or once we finish, and that we'll be looking at these different levels of support and of data as we begin to write our assessment reports. If you need to go through and score your Woodcock-Johnson, this is a nice little step-by-step what you need to do for scoring that. And if you need a, actually we can write in here, Dr. Jez and Professor Talbot both have some login username and password if you need to use our username and password for your student. That's just fine. Next, we talked about, we reviewed once again the information that we had done week 3 or 4, I think it was, that was on statistics. We reviewed the standard deviation. Remember, the mean is the average score, and then most scores fall within 1 standard deviation, which is 68%. And so if you're plus 1 standard deviation, you're above the mean. If you're minus 1 standard deviation, you're below the mean. The percentile ranks go from 1 to 99, with 50 being in the center. These are different than percentages. This is where you fall in relationship to other people. Then you have the standard scores, which you see 55, and then this one goes to 145. And this helps you see when they took the score, you know, a test that has different numbers that the average 3rd grader, for example, would get right, then they can actually standardize it for 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade using the standard score. And the center is usually 100, and then it's 15, plus 15 or minus 15. And those are the ones, big ones for the interpreting the test scores. The other thing that we want to remember is the independent, instructional, and frustration reading levels. And we've got independent is 95 or above, instructional is 90 to 95, and frustration is below 90. And this also goes in with what we talked about with the relative proficiency index. We had you do an activity where you explained the relative proficiency index about this student, and then we gave you some sentences. And you can actually take these exact sentences and then change them for your student if that's helpful for you, as long as you actually understand it to the level of being able to answer questions on it. So, and once again, here's the RPI, and this assuming that 90%, because we remember 90% here is frustration. So right there above that is instructional. So we want all students to be at instructional. So we've got averages, right there between 82 and 95, and then below 82 is really where they've got limited to average ability, and it's more difficult. So, all right, this is the standard score and percentile rank. Once again, just reminders of those. And then when you have the last, remember this last area here is classification or implication. It's called different things on different tests. That's why I put both in your template. But here is, if you find out the standard score, then you can know the classification. You'll just figure out which subtests you use. So this one may be right, this one might not be right. So you've got to figure out what tests your student was administered, and then once again, standard score, either the grade or age equivalent, but not both. Then the percentile and the classification or implications. Or interpretation, I guess is what I used. So here's an example right here. So they talked about which test they gave, and then here's standard score, age equivalent. Notice that they don't have grade equivalent. Relative proficiency index, and classification for each of the subtests. Then we have the recommendation. So this is the part where I mentioned, now what do we do? Knowing that piece is really important. So I gave you some, here is one of the documents. So say that they didn't do well on the reading comprehension section. So this is the contents of it. All these pieces go into reading comprehension. These are all the subtests for it. And then you can go through with further evaluation and then accommodations if they're at the instructional level. And they just, for color coding, taped books, general recommendations. So you can reading material. So they actually go through and they talk about some pieces that you can do. That's a really helpful tool to have as you go through and start thinking about, well, what do these results mean? Then here's another one where this is the administration training manual for Frederick County Public Schools, but they actually also go through and they talk about, I liked this manual because they go through and they talk about, like, okay, this is all the general stuff, here's the scoring, and then a little bit after that, oops, if you want some more support on the scoring, that's there. But then they talk about English language learners, the different types of things there. Hold on, I'm going to get to what I'm talking about. Here we go. Boom. This is all still administration. Hold on. Whoops. So they go through and they talk about each one of the assessments so that you can see what's in that assessment, what they're actually testing. There's and then interpreting the reading scores. So if they have low scores, it might mean that they haven't developed automatic word identification skills, for example. So this is going to help you. So this is starting on page 40. They go through and talk about this. They also have the complexity, more complex and less complex, just like the other slide that I showed you. So taking some time to kind of go through this if you're curious about what the scores mean and how you can apply that information. Excuse me. Next is scoring the Brigance. Remember, we recommended you just use this this chart where you write down what the subtest was, the raw score percentage, and then what did you learn from it? What do they need to do, for example? Here's the San Diego Quick, and remember you're finding independent instructional and frustration levels, and so that you have those all right there. You could use these, if you did multiple probes, then you could use the EasyCBM progress monitoring chart that they have. Here's an example of using a rubric and then learning from the rubric. And here's the work sample. So you can see that this has been graded, the notes are on there, the rationalization is there, and the directions are there. And the qualitative observation section. So this is where you're bringing together your protocol, the notes you wrote on the protocol, your classroom observations, and your stakeholder input from the interviews. And you're writing about how the student performs behaviorally, basically. And so in structured time, unstructured time, during the test, and then any sort of strategies that you saw the student using. This is a great way to really highlight some of the positives that the student was able to do during testing to help them get through. So, and then here's a nice little chart on qualitative and quantitative data. Here's some examples. Remember that we've got examples in here, and then we also have the strengths. And this is where you're going to be combining the quantitative, so the percentile scores, the RPI. Raw scores aren't great because they don't tell us too much about what was specifically going on. But then you're also going to give, here's percentile, you're also going to give examples. But please don't use the words from the actual test. Change the words up to something similar. Here's another example of a strengths section. Remember, you have to have 3 strengths, and here this person used the RPI, explained the proficiency part. And then also what she said, like, these words are crazy. So you can get to know the student and see their strengths and start out that way. Areas of growth, once again 3, and you've got to give qualitative and quantitative information to support your claims of those 3 areas. I think it's probably reasonable that you'll have at least 1 paragraph per area. So this one is applied problems, this next one was for writing, and the third one was for writing fluency. And then they brought in all 3 of the tests as well when they're talking about it. So you don't just talk about the Woodcock-Johnson, you talk about also the other assessments and how they supported. So here's another example. They've got the Woodcock-Johnson, they've got the Easy CBM, and then most likely word sample as well in here. So, so all 3 assessments should be in here in this section of areas of growth, because this is what you're going to be using to write their suggested IEP goals. Remember, they may have many areas of growth, but you're only picking the top 3, and then you're going to be writing goals around those top 3. So next week on April 4th, this is the group that will be with me online, and what we'll most likely be doing is writing the areas of growth and the strength, or checking the writing of the areas of growth in the strengths section and the observation section to make sure that we have all the pieces we need in there. And this week we've got Overton, Chapter 13, we asked you to read the Grecian urns story, and then, of course, administering your assessment, and then working with whichever person you'll be working with. So the next slide I'm going to show you is actually basically the rubric that we're going to use for my group next week, so that you'll all have that, so you'll understand what it is that you're looking for. All right, so this is basically the rubric that I'm going to use next week for our time together. We will be reading each other's qualitative observation section, and we'll be checking to make sure that the observations came from multiple people, so the family, the teacher, the examiner, etc., and that the observations were from multiple settings, so structured, unstructured, and through the testing. The strengths, we'll be looking to make sure that they identified 3 strengths and found supportive details from all of the assessments, so the norm reference, criterion reference, work sample, observation, and interviews. And the areas of growth were also that there were 3 that were chosen, and that supportive details were found from the assessments, the norm reference, criterion. And actually I'm going to add to here both qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative and quantitative. So you do have to include actual data from the test results or from the observations. So let's just go through, and then I put a link to the template that you all should be using. So here's the academic assessment report. You're going to put the pseudonym there, the birth date, languages, LPAC scores if they're an ELL, and in a way that makes sense for a parent to read. You've got to imagine that this report is being written for the parents, for the school as well, but and other teachers, but for people who aren't necessarily familiar with what LPAC is. Then you're going to describe how the academic, behavioral, or social concerns, for example, the disability, manifests for the student. That was the number one comment that we made when we were grading this section, so make sure that you actually include what it looks like for that child. ADHD, autism can look different for different people. You're going to put the chronological age and grade and then your name in here. You're going to list, so write one sentence explaining each assessment and the date that it was administered. And you can just put the dates in parentheses next to the sentence. But you need to tell what the norm referenced assessment was, the criterion referenced assessment, the work samples, who you interviewed for teachers, with the, that you used the CRSTP to interview the child, which is the culturally responsive student transition presentation. And then the date, don't forget the date, and then the family interview, classroom observations, whatever day you did that, for both the structured and unstructured, their hearing and vision test, and then the student background. Remember, the educational history is about the what schools the student has attended, what their grades have been in the past, if they've had any suspensions or office referrals or anything like that, so that you've got that written. For the family interview, remember the 3 questions are, what are the student's strengths, what concerns do you have, and what else should I know? The educator interview, same thing, and there should be more than one. Then the student interview, the narrative about the CRSTP, and then the classroom observations, both the structured and unstructured. Then you're going to put the results section. So if you're doing the KTEA, then you're going to change these subtests, but you're still going to write standard score, either age or grade, erase whichever one you didn't do, percentile rank, and classification interpretation. And then if you did the Wilcox-Johnson, then this is correct. So notice that some of the report might talk about percentile rank, others might talk about the relative proficiency index. So whichever scores you have, then you want to make sure to have those printed out. Then for the criterion referenced assessment, you're going to give the 10 subtests, and you're going to tell why you gave that subtest or what you learned from it. The work sample, you're going to make sure to insert a picture, talk about why you chose that, and then what directions were given. And then the qualitative observation section, you're going to write all about the different sources that you got the information from, and then the different settings. Strengths, this is where you have probably 3 paragraphs about the strengths, where you include the quantitative and qualitative data, and then areas of growth. Once again, whatever 3 areas of growth will go into your suggested IEP goals, but this is where we're going to stop for now. We'll be working on the rest of this in April. So this should take us through till the end of class next week. If you need any support with anything, please do reach out. We just want to see you be the most successful that you can. So I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.